You wake in a room with no windows, where the air is so still it feels rotten. The stone floor drains the warmth from your skin, and every breath carries the metallic taste of rust. Outside, you hear no birds, no wind, only the pounding of boots echoing like hammers striking your chest. These are not steps that bring rescue. These are steps that announce ownership. The door before you never opens to freedom. It is not a threshold. It is a wound in the wall, a hole through which men enter who call themselves soldiers, yet behave like butchers. They claim to serve an empire, but what they truly serve is the hunger of their own power. What does a flag mean when your body becomes a trophy? What does an anthem mean when it buries your screams inside its hollow melody? The room reeks of those who came before you, of fear that has piled up, of stories buried in silence. You wonder how many, before you, heard those boots. How many realized the door was not a passage, but a sentence. The iron creaks, the latch turns, and your heart beats louder than the steps drawing near. The empire needs no visible chains. Its prison is more delicate. The suffocation of waiting, the tremor of uncertainty, the certainty that each opening of that door brings new humiliation. And the most terrifying thing is not the captivity itself, but knowing that the world outside pretends not to hear the blows. You remember how the shadow began, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Women torn from markets, from temples, from their own homes. Some deceived with promises of work, others dragged by force under the glint of bayonets. There was always a cart waiting, always a hand smothering the mouth, always a silence falling over the family left behind. Mothers collapsed on thresholds, fathers screamed until their throats split, but the echo dissolved quickly. No one came, no one dared. In the villages, fear was a god more powerful than any flag. Each absence became a tomb without a body, a mourning without a name, a shame that forced eyes to the ground. What at first seemed like an isolated tragedy revealed its true face, a vast network, dark and spreading like poisoned roots across Asia. It was not the crime of a few men, but an entire system, fed by ships, by records, by stamped orders. The nightmare no longer bore a human face. It became a machine that crushed identities, that turned entire communities into a catalog of disposable bodies. And you understood that your fate was not individual, but a cog in the great harvest of shadows. The closed room where you breathe fear is only a cell within a much larger monster, and its tentacles still drag bodies into the darkness. They never saw you as human. To them, you were not a daughter, not a sister, not even a name. You were a number on a ledger, a quota to be filled, a piece of flesh categorized alongside food, boots, and bullets. The empire rationed you the way it rationed ammunition, distributed as if you were both weapon and spoil. Comfort, they called it, but it was no comfort at all. It was invasion disguised as necessity, cruelty stamped as order. The soldiers arrived in rotations, their hunger treated as legitimate strategy. You were lined up like inventory, inspected, claimed, consumed. They called it discipline, keeping men obedient by feeding them bodies. What was your worth when a commander's pen stroke could decide whether you lived or were discarded? What was your identity when stripped down you were only supply, a commodity passed from hand to hand, night to night? Each touch was not desire but doctrine, each violation a lesson, that your body belonged to the war, not to yourself. And worse than the pain was the silence that followed, the suffocating realization that the system had erased even the language to name your suffering. How do you scream when every word has already been stolen? The empire's cruelty was not chaos, it was mathematics. Flesh calculated, dignity rationed, identity erased with bureaucratic precision. You were reduced to necessity, your humanity itemized on paper. And yet, in that reduction lay the seed of scars that would outlive the war itself. Scars that would cling to generations who never stepped inside those rooms. Each touch was not desire but doctrine, each violation a lesson, that your body belonged to the war, not to yourself. And worse than the pain was the silence that followed, the suffocating realization that the system had erased even the language to name your suffering. How do you scream when every word has already been stolen? The empire's cruelty was not chaos, it was mathematics. Flesh calculated, dignity rationed, identity erased with bureaucratic precision. You were reduced to necessity, your humanity itemized on paper. And yet, in that reduction lay the seed of scars that would outlive the war itself. Scars that would cling to generations who never stepped inside those rooms. The first thing they took was not your body, it was your name. Names were too personal, too human. They replaced them with numbers scribbled in ledgers, or nicknames spat with laughter, words sharp enough to cut, but hollow enough to erase. You became 32, fourth in line, the quiet one. With every utterance, the sound of who you once were faded deeper into the void. A name carries memory, family, a thread to the world outside. Without it, you drifted like a ghost, a presence unmoored, belonging to no place and no one. When they called for you, it was not recognition, it was command. A number cannot be mourned, it can only be tallied. And so, each day, a part of you vanished, piece by piece, syllable by syllable, until the girl you remembered felt like someone else's dream. Some tried to whisper their real names at night, clinging to them as if to a candle in the dark. But even those syllables began to tremble, fragile under the weight of repetition. Silence became safer than memory, forgetting easier than resisting. This was the empire's cruelest arithmetic. Bodies could be broken, but names could be erased entirely. And in the end, the absence of identity was a wound deeper than any bruise, a battlefield carved not on skin, but within the soul. Night after night, the war carved itself into your flesh, not with bullets or bayonets, but with wounds that festered in silence. The body became a battlefield where violence was repeated until it no longer needed shouting, only the rhythm of footsteps, the closing of doors, the weight pressing down until breath itself felt stolen. Infections spread where there was no medicine. Fever burned through skin already raw with bruises. Some carried pregnancies like unwanted flags of conquest, their bellies turning into reminders of every night stolen. And when the empire decided those lives were inconvenient, knives and chemicals were forced upon you, erasing both child and mother with the same indifference. There was no pause between assaults, no time to heal. The body was treated as ground to be conquered again and again, mapped and claimed until it felt foreign to you. Each scar was a signature of war, each wound a message written in blood. You are not yours, you are ours. But the worst agony was not the breaking of skin, it was the quiet. The muffled cries, the stifled coughs, the silence that stretched through the night like a second prison. Violence so constant it became atmosphere. And in that suffocating air, you understood the truth. The battlefield was not somewhere far away, it was inside you, and it would never let you leave whole. When the gunfire finally ceased, you thought silence might bring release. But the end of war did not end the prison. The soldiers left, yet the wounds remained, stitched into your body, etched into your memory. And when you returned to the world you once called home, you found that peace carried a cruelty sharper than war itself. Families turned away, unable or unwilling to see what had been carved into you. Some whispered blame, others shut their doors, as if your survival were a stain on their honor. Government spoke of rebuilding, of glory, of national pride, but not of you. Your suffering was inconvenient, too shameful to fit into parades and speeches. So they erased you with silence, the way a ledger erases numbers when no longer useful. You were left in the ruins, carrying memories no anthem would acknowledge, no monument would name. The war had stolen your body, peace stole your voice. Which betrayal cut deeper, the violation by enemies or the rejection by those you had once trusted to protect you? The silence after gunfire is heavier than the explosions themselves. It does not fade. It lingers, seeps, settles into your bones. And in that stillness, you realize peace was never meant for you. Years turned into decades, yet the silence never loosened its grip. Survivors walked through life like shadows, their bodies alive, but their voices buried. They carried their memories not as stories, but as weights pressed deep into the marrow. To speak was to reopen the wound. To remain silent was to let it rot inside. Most chose silence. Some died with their truths clenched between their teeth, graves filled with secrets no one dared to carve into stone. Others lived as ghosts within their own families, sitting at dinner tables yet never fully present, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. Children grew up sensing a fracture they could not name, an absence that whispered through generations. Time did not heal, it fossilized. Shame calcified into bone, turning silence itself into another weapon, another form of violence. The empire had long collapsed, the soldiers long vanished, but the machinery of erasure remained, ticking quietly inside every unspoken word. And so the decades stretched on, a landscape of unmarked graves and unvoiced confessions. The survivors were still among the living, but history had already treated them as if they were gone. It was not the passage of time that broke the silence, but the weight of it. By the 1990s, the shadows had grown too heavy to be carried alone. One by one, women stepped forward, their voices trembling yet unyielding. They spoke not to reclaim youth, already stolen, but to reclaim truth, the one thing the empire had failed to erase. The testimonies came like ruptures in the earth, quaking, uncontainable. A woman in Korea, another in the Philippines, one in China, then Indonesia, voices scattered across borders but bound by the same wound. Each word felt like tearing open flesh that had never healed, yet from that rawness came power. Pain, once suffocated in silence, now spilled into microphones, into courtrooms, into the world. Denial met them instantly. Governments shrugged, historians dissembled, whole nations covered their ears. But memory, once spoken, cannot be buried again. Every testimony was a stone thrown against the glass of forgetting, each crack spreading wider. The women pointed not only to their scars, but to the hypocrisy of civilizations that celebrated honor while feeding on humiliation. They stood trembling, yet their trembling was stronger than the silence that had caged them for half a century. And in their voices, the ghosts of the nameless spoke too, those who had died with secrets locked in their throats. For the first time, the world was forced to look directly at the wound it had chosen to ignore. Denial arrived dressed in diplomacy. Officials bowed, shook hands, and spoke of progress, but behind their smiles was a refusal sharper than any blade. Governments called the women liars, or exaggerated storytellers, or simply unfortunate casualties of war. The crime was not just dismissed, it was rewritten, minimized, polished until it seemed almost invisible. For the survivors, this was a second violation. To stand in courtrooms, to march in protests, to bear the scars of their bodies and memories, only to be told it was not enough. Every testimony became another trial, every word a reopening of the wound. The humiliation they had endured in silence was now paraded in public, doubted, dissected, and dismissed. The betrayal cut deeper than the violence itself. The empire had stripped their flesh, but now nations stripped their truth. What is justice when memory itself is placed on trial? What is peace when denial makes the wound bleed anew? The women had survived soldiers, only to be broken again by silence disguised as diplomacy. And so the wound of history widened, not because of what had been done, but because of what the world still refused to admit. A stone, a statue, a trembling voice. These became weapons more powerful than rifles. Memory itself turned into rebellion. Where governments sought erasure, survivors built monuments. Where silence had been demanded, they carved their testimonies into marble and bronze, into books and into the fragile air of classrooms. Each act of remembrance was defiance, proof that even erased names could return to speak. They stood as the last soldiers of memory, not with uniforms, but with scars, not with bayonets, but with trembling hands raised against forgetting. Every story told was a battle won against the empire's ghost, every monument a fortress where denial could not easily enter. The world often walked past those statues, past those plaques, without looking, but their presence was enough. Like shadows that refused to vanish in daylight, memory lingered, insistent, unavoidable. And in this persistence lies a philosophy. History is not only what was done, but what refuses to be silenced. The survivors may fade, their voices thinning with age, but memory, once spoken, cannot be buried again. To remember is to resist. To testify is to rise. And in the quiet rhythm of their stories, you begin to understand. Memory itself is a battlefield, and to carry it forward is the final act of defiance. War has always been a theater, and the body its most obedient stage. Empires march beneath banners, but their true victories are not measured in land. They are measured in how completely they can claim flesh. To own a body is to own silence, to rewrite identity, to bend humanity into spectacle. Cruelty, then, is not chaos, it is performance. A soldier does not violate only to satisfy hunger, but to prove that power can reach beneath the skin, can brand itself upon another's very being. The wound is not accidental, it is the signature of authority. And what does this reveal about us, about civilization itself? Foucault once wrote that power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. If that is true, then cruelty is not just an aberration of war, it is the hidden language of order, the underside of discipline, the truth society buries beneath medals and anthems. So ask yourself, when the body is turned into property, when dignity is rationed like ammunition, is war simply conflict? Or is it the most honest mirror of what humanity truly is? Sartre said, hell is other people. But perhaps the greater hell is this, to realize that other people are the architects of your silence. Shame does not end with the body that first bore it. It seeps outward, a poison carried in whispers, in glances, in the unspoken weight of family dinners. Children grow up in households where silence sits heavier than furniture, where mothers avert their eyes at questions, where fathers carry grief they cannot name. The wound becomes inheritance. You see it in the way descendants hesitate to speak of history, as if their tongues were bound by chains they never felt. You hear it in lullabies that trail off into quiet, in family stories that skip entire years. Trauma becomes the architecture of memory, shaping lives that were never meant to carry it. Communities fracture under its shadow. Some drown in denial, others in bitterness. Whole generations feel a shame that was never theirs, yet clings as if stitched into their skin. The empire may have fallen, but its cruelty lives on in the marrow of those who never saw its flags. This is the most insidious victory of violence, not the conquest of land, but the conquest of memory across bloodlines. And so the children inherit not only names and faces, but the silence of wounds unspoken. What is buried in one body does not stay buried, it echoes. They walked among the living, yet they were treated as though they had already died. Survivors moved through streets invisible, their bodies present but their existence denied. Some were mocked as liars, others dismissed as burdens. Their voices met not with compassion but with impatience. To be forgotten while breathing, that was the empire's final cruelty. They became ghosts long before the grave claimed them. Their laughter sounded hollow. Their steps left no trace. Their reflections in mirrors looked like strangers. The world preferred them silent, spectral, reduced to shadows at the edge of memory. What does it mean to be alive when no one recognizes your suffering as real? Death at least offers closure. Erasure offers nothing, only a living exile, a slow fading where flesh turns transparent. The survivors carried scars, but the world looked past them, as though the wounds were illusions, as though history itself could be denied by closing one's eyes. In this blurred existence, the line between life and death dissolved. They breathed, they aged, they endured, but inside they wandered the corridors of absence. And perhaps that was the cruelest fate of all. Not to die, but to keep living as a ghost no one wished to see. History does not remember everything. It remembers what is convenient, what flatters nations, what can be polished into pride. The rest is left to rot in the margins. And so the voices of the comfort women remain peripheral, spoken yet seldom heard, recorded yet rarely taught. Their suffering is archived in footnotes, overshadowed by the louder narratives of generals, treaties, and victories. This is not mere accident. It is willful blindness. To acknowledge them fully would mean to confront the hypocrisy of civilization itself, the fact that empires were built not only on conquest, but on the silence of the violated. It would mean admitting that progress carries a skeleton in its foundations, that modern pride is rooted in ancient humiliation. And so forgetting becomes a choice dressed as inevitability. Museums pass quickly over the testimonies. Textbooks soften or omit. Politicians speak of reconciliation, but rarely of truth. The world moves on, but only by stepping over the bodies it refuses to name. What does it say about humanity when memory itself is rationed? When the cries of the powerless are preserved only as background noise to the songs of power? Perhaps the cruelest wound is not that the crimes were committed, but that the world continues to decide they are not worth remembering. Ash drifts on the wind, carried from fires long extinguished. It settles on forgotten fields, on rivers that once ran red, on villages where doors were left open but never returned to. Each grain is a memory, fragile yet unyielding, glowing faintly in the dusk. The world may not bend down to see it, but the ashes remain, clinging to soil, to stone, to silence. You imagine the women as those ashes, scattered, trampled, invisible to hurried feet. Yet still they shimmer, faintly, stubbornly, against the weight of forgetting. Their voices rise not as thunder, but as whispers, drifting across borders, refusing to vanish. Memory may be silenced, but like ash it stains whatever it touches. So the question falls upon you, heavy as the dusk itself. What does it mean if we let them fade? If their pain dissolves into statistics, if their names are left unspoken, what does that say about us? Are we not then complicit in the same cruelty, choosing blindness, rehearsing silence, turning the living into ghosts once more? The prayer of ashes is not for them alone. It is for us, for the living who must decide whether memory will remain ember or be smothered. History is watching, and the silence we choose today will echo far longer than the gunfire ever did.